The old pines surrounding the town of Oakhaven stood as silent, watchful giants, their branches weaving a tapestry that blurred the line between earth and sky. It was a place where the air always smelled of damp earth and wild blueberries, a place where the modern world felt like a distant rumor. And on the very edge of this town, where the well-kept gardens gave way to the untamed wildness of the forest, lived a young woman named Elara. Her little cottage, with its slightly sagging porch and cheerful flower-filled window boxes, was the only speck of light for miles once the sun dipped below the tree line. Elara was an artist, and her world was built of colors and quiet observations. She saw the subtle shift from sage green to emerald in the moss on the north side of the trees, and she could spend an entire afternoon trying to capture the exact silver gray of a rain-heavy cloud. She lived a life of comfortable solitude, her only company the chatter of squirrels and the occasional visit from a curious fox. Her nearest and only neighbor was a man named Tenebris. His cabin was deeper in the woods, a sturdy structure of dark timber that seemed to grow directly from the forest floor. He was a man of few words and quiet movements, a stark contrast to the boisterous loggers and hunters who sometimes passed through Oakhaven. Tenebris was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strength that seemed inherent, like the gnarled roots of an ancient oak. His eyes were the color of a forest twilight, a deep and shadowy hazel that held a gravity Elara couldn't quite decipher. He was polite but always distant, a silent figure she would sometimes see chopping wood or simply standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the woods as if listening to a secret conversation. Despite his imposing presence, he had never been anything but kind. When a sudden storm sent a branch through Elara's roof, it was Tenebris who appeared the next morning with his tools and repaired it without a word, refusing any payment except a cup of tea. One evening, long after the fireflies had retired and the world was painted in shades of indigo and ink, Elara was awakened by a sound. It wasn't the usual hoot of an owl or the rustle of a raccoon. It was a howl. But this was unlike any wolf howl she had ever heard in nature documentaries. It was a long, low, mournful note that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of her cottage, a sound filled with such profound loneliness that it made her heart ache. Curiosity, a dangerous and compelling force, pulled her from her bed and to the window. Peering through the glass, her breath fogging the pane, she saw it. There in the moon-drenched clearing stood a wolf. It was enormous, its fur the color of freshly fallen snow touched by moonlight, a stark, luminous creature in the darkness. But it was its eyes that held her captive. They were not the wild, feral eyes of a beast, but a familiar, intelligent, and deeply sad hazel. The wolf looked directly at her, and in that moment, Elara felt a strange and impossible sense of recognition, a thread of connection that defied all logic. It did not snarl or advance. It simply stood watching her before melting back into the shadows of the trees as silently as it had appeared. The next morning, the memory felt like a dream, but a compelling one. The woods seemed to call to her. With her sketchbook tucked under her arm, she ventured beyond her garden, following a path she usually avoided. The forest was quieter than normal, the birdsong hushed. It was then that she saw them, a set of paw prints pressed deep into the soft mud near a creek. They were far too large to belong to any ordinary wolf. A mix of fear and unwavering curiosity spurred her forward, her artist's mind needing to trace the source of this mystery. She followed the trail until it led her to a small, hidden glen. And there, sitting on a moss-covered log with his head in his hands, was Tenebris. He looked up as she approached, and the shock and sheer panic on his face was unmistakable. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and he looked utterly exhausted as if he hadn't slept for days. "Elara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "You shouldn't be out here." Her eyes drifted from his tired face to the torn fabric of his shirt, then back to the giant paw prints that led directly to where he sat. The pieces, impossible as they were, clicked into place. The silver wolf. The sad, familiar eyes. The howl of profound loneliness. The quiet, strong neighbor who always seemed to understand the secrets of the forest. Tenebris saw the understanding dawn on her face, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He rose slowly, not as a threat, but as a man burdened by a terrible truth. "The wolf you saw last night?" he began, his voice a low whisper. "It was me." He explained it as simply as he could. He was a werewolf, a person with two natures, bound to the rhythms of the moon. He was part of a small, secret pack, the Guardians, who had protected these woods for generations. He told her of the constant struggle to control the wildness inside, the fear of losing himself to the beast. "My secret is the most dangerous thing you could know," he said, his twilight eyes pleading with her. "Please, you must promise to tell no one." Elara stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. She looked at the man before her, not as a monster, but as the kind neighbor who had fixed her roof and whose eyes held the same deep sadness as the magnificent wolf. Her heart, not her fear, answered for her. "I promise," she whispered into the quiet of the glen, sealing a fate she could not yet begin to imagine. The silence that settled between Elara and Tenebris after his confession was not the uncomfortable, brittle kind that shatters at the slightest movement. Instead, it was a heavy, living quiet, thick with unspoken questions and a shared, monumental understanding. The world had not changed, the sun still dappled through the pine canopy, the creek still whispered its ancient secrets, but Elara's perception of it was forever altered. The forest was no longer just a place of beauty and solitude, it was now a realm of hidden magic and silent guardians. Tenebris, for his part, seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for the fear and rejection he so clearly expected. When Elara simply nodded, her promise hanging in the air between them, a visible tension drained from his broad shoulders. It was the first thread of a new, fragile trust. In the days and weeks that followed, a new routine began to weave itself around the edges of their separate lives. Tenebris, no longer burdened with the exhausting effort of hiding his entire nature from his closest neighbor, began to cautiously let Elara in. He started by showing her the forest as he knew it. He taught her to read the subtle signs he lived by, the specific way the birds fell silent when a predator that was not him passed through, the meaning behind different scratches on the tree bark, the hidden paths that were invisible to a human eye but were as clear as paved roads to him. He walked beside her, a constant, protective presence, his movements so fluid and silent that he seemed more a part of the woods than a man walking through them. Elara listened, her artist's soul captivated by this deeper, richer layer of the world she loved. She began to see the wilderness not as a landscape, but as a living, breathing community with its own rules and rhythms. It was during one of these long, meandering walks that the careful distance between them finally began to dissolve. They were following a narrow game trail along a ridge, the conversation having lapsed into a comfortable silence. Elara, her mind busy trying to memorize the specific shape of a rare, bioluminescent fungus Tenebris had pointed out, misjudged the edge of the path. Her foot caught on a gnarled root hidden under a blanket of fallen leaves, and with a sharp cry, she stumbled forward, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening, painful wrench. She fell to the soft earth, a gasp of shock and pain escaping her lips as she clutched her leg. "Go slow, it hurts," she moaned, the words coming out as a breathless plea as the throbbing ache radiated up her limb. Tenebris was at her side in an instant, moving with a speed that was more than human. His face, usually so guarded, was etched with raw, undisguised worry. His large, capable hands, which she had seen effortlessly split logs, hovered over her injured ankle with a trembling, almost reverent caution. He was afraid to touch her, terrified that his inherent strength, even in his human form, might cause her more pain. "Elara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. He looked from her tear-filled eyes to her ankle and back, his own expression one of acute agony. Without a word, he carefully, so carefully, slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her from the ground as if she were made of the most delicate glass. He held her cradled against his chest, her head resting naturally in the hollow of his shoulder, and began the slow, deliberate walk back to her cottage. Every step he took was measured and gentle, his entire being focused on absorbing the shocks of the path so she wouldn't have to. He carried her all the way to her doorstep, shouldered the door open, and brought her directly to her overstuffed armchair by the cold fireplace. He knelt before her, his head bowed for a moment as if gathering his courage. Then, with hands that shook with the effort of their control, he gently removed her shoe. His touch was feather-light, a whisper against her skin as he examined the swelling. He fetched a bowl of cold water and a cloth, and with a patience that seemed infinite, he began to bathe her ankle, the cool compress a welcome relief to the heat of the injury. The entire time, the air in the small cottage was charged with a new and powerful energy. The careful boundary between neighbor and something more was crumbling. As he worked, his head still bent over his task, he spoke, his voice a low, hushed whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He wasn't just talking about her twisted ankle. He was speaking of the beast that lived within him, the wild, powerful force he wrestled with every day. He looked up, and his twilight eyes captured hers, holding her with an intensity that stole her breath. "I need you to understand," he said, the words filled with a solemn, earth-shattering vow. "That part of me, the wolf. I'll die before I hurt you." The promise hung in the quiet of the cottage, more binding than any legal document, more real than the very walls around them. It was not just a reassurance, it was a declaration. In that moment, Elara did not see a monster or even just a kind neighbor. She saw a man of immense power who had chosen to kneel at her feet, offering her a devotion so absolute it was terrifying in its purity. Her fear had long since vanished, replaced by a feeling so warm and expansive it made her chest feel tight. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead. The simple contact sent a jolt through both of them, a silent acknowledgement of the profound shift that had just occurred. He had shown her the darkest part of his soul and had sworn to protect her from it with his very life. And in the quiet understanding that passed between them, Elara knew her own heart was no longer entirely her own. The friendship they had carefully built had, in the space of a fall and a whispered promise, deepened into the beginnings of a bond that felt as ancient and unbreakable as the forest itself. The fragile peace that had settled over the forest and the two souls within it was not destined to last. The change in the air was subtle at first, a shift that only Tenebris, with his deep connection to the woods, could truly sense. The birds, who had grown accustomed to his presence, now fell into a dead silence when he passed, their little bodies rigid with a fear that was new and different. The scent on the wind changed, carrying the sharp, aggressive musk of other wolves, but it was wrong. It was tainted with a kind of carelessness, a disregard for the delicate balance of the territory. Tenebris became more watchful, his easy strides turning into a cautious patrol. He began walking Elara back to her cottage not just at dusk, but long before the shadows began to stretch, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The gentle, patient man who had tended to her ankle was being slowly replaced by a tense, protective guardian, his every instinct on high alert. The threat made itself known on an afternoon when the sky was a hard, cloudless blue. Tenebris and Elara were in her garden, where he was helping her mend a section of the fence that had been weakened by winter storms. The work was simple, their movements falling into a comfortable rhythm, a small echo of the normal life they both secretly craved. The peace was shattered by the sudden, silent emergence of a man from the edge of the woods. He was tall, like Tenebris, but where Tenebris's strength was like the solid, grounded power of a mountain, this man's was the sharp, predatory kind of a lightning strike. His hair was the color of rust and his eyes held a cold, yellow fire. He moved with a swagger that was entirely absent in Tenebris, a confidence that spoke of domination, not guardianship. This was Rorik. He didn't speak at first, his cold gaze sweeping over the cozy cottage, the well-tended garden, and finally landing on Elara with a look of pure contempt before shifting to Tenebris. Tenebris, Rorik's voice was a low growl, devoid of warmth. I heard you were playing house with a human. I didn't believe it. He took a step closer, his nostrils flaring as if smelling something rotten. The great guardian, weakened by sentiment. Tenebris moved instantly, placing his body squarely between Rorik and Elara. The air crackled with a tension that was both human and deeply primal. This is not your territory, Rorik, Tenebris said, his voice low and dangerously calm. You and your shadow pack are not welcome here. Rorik let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. Your pack is small, Tenebris. You cling to old rules, to this forest as if it belongs to you. The strong take what they want. That is the only law. His eyes flicked back to Elara, who stood frozen by the fence post, her hand gripping the wood so tightly her knuckles were white. And she is a weakness I can exploit. He stated it as a simple, brutal fact. He then issued his challenge, his voice ringing through the clearing. I challenge you for the alpha title of this territory. A fight for dominance. Under the full moon. Unless you're too attached to your pet to remember what it means to be a real wolf. The challenge hung in the air, an unchangeable decree. As Rorik melted back into the forest as suddenly as he had appeared, a profound silence descended. Tenebris did not move for a long time, his back still to Elara, his shoulders rigid. When he finally turned to face her, the look in his eyes was a storm of conflict. There was the fierce, protective instinct of the wolf, the deep-seated duty of the guardian, and a new, terrifying fear, not for himself but for her. He had two battles to fight now. The first was the physical, brutal contest for leadership under the full moon, a fight he was strong enough to win. But the second, far more insidious battle, was the one Rorik had already begun, a war of intimidation aimed directly at Elara. Tenebris had sworn to die before hurting her, but now he faced a far more complex terror, the possibility that his very existence, his nature, his world, would be the thing that brought her harm. The sanctuary of the forest had been violated, and the simple, growing love between them was now a strategic liability in a coming war. The days leading to the full moon were a study in strange silence and unspoken dread. The air itself grew thick and heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath in anticipation of the coming storm. Tenebris became a ghost in his own life, his presence around Elara's cottage reduced to a series of protective, fleeting visits. He would appear at dawn to check the perimeter, his eyes, now more wolf than man, scanning the trees for any sign of the shadow pack. He would return at dusk, not to sit by her fire, but to stand watch on her porch, a silent, brooding sentinel against the deepening twilight. The gentle man who had taught her the secrets of the woods was receding, replaced by the primal alpha preparing for a fight to the death. He tried to explain the rules of the challenge to her, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was a pure contest, a clash of tooth and claw under the moon's impartial eye. There could be no interference. The winner would claim the territory and the loyalty of the packs. The loser would be driven out or worse. Elara listened, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest, but she said nothing of the plan already forming in her own mind, a plan born not of physical strength, but of a deep, unwavering love and a clever understanding of her own capabilities. The night of the full moon arrived, a vast silver-white disk that bathed the world in an eerie, magical light. It cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. The chosen clearing, a wide, rocky basin deep in the heart of the forest, felt like a natural arena. The air was electric with the tension of the two assembled packs, Tenebris's small, steadfast guardians and Rorik's larger, restless shadow pack, their collective energy a palpable force. Elara stood hidden within the treeline as Tenebris had sternly commanded her to do, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She watched as the two men faced each other in the center of the clearing. Then the transformation began. It was not the dramatic, bone-snapping change of legend, but something both more terrible and more beautiful. Their forms seemed to shimmer and flow, human contours dissolving and reforming in a cascade of light and shadow, until where two men had stood, two enormous wolves now faced one another. Tenebris was a magnificent creature of moonlight and silver, his form radiating a noble, controlled power. Rorik was a beast of darkness and rust-colored fur, larger and bulkier, his muzzle pulled back in a perpetual vicious snarl. The fight was a brutal, breathtaking dance of primal force. They moved with a speed that was almost impossible to follow, a blur of silver and russet under the cold eye of the moon. Snarls and the sickening thud of bodies colliding echoed through the clearing. Tenebris was faster, more agile, using the wisdom of a true guardian to parry and evade Rorik's brute force charges. He landed biting blows on Rorik's shoulders and flanks, his strategy one of precision and endurance. But Rorik was relentless, his attacks fueled by a raw, hateful fury. He managed to sink his teeth deep into Tenebris's hind leg, causing the silver wolf to stumble with a pained yelp. Elara's breath caught in her throat, her own body trembling with shared agony. She saw the tide of the battle turning, saw Rorik gaining the upper hand through sheer dirty tactics, using his weight to pin Tenebris, his jaws seeking a fatal grip on his rival's throat. It was then that Rorik, in a moment of cunning malice, locked his yellow eyes with Elara's from across the clearing. He saw her, the source of Tenebris's perceived weakness, and he saw his ultimate victory. With a final, powerful shove, he threw Tenebris aside and instead of pressing his attack, he turned and launched himself directly toward Elara. A collective gasp rippled through the watching packs. Tenebris struggled to rise, a roar of pure despair tearing from his wolfish throat. But Elara did not run. Fear turned her veins to ice, but it also crystallized her resolve. As the massive, snarling wolf closed the distance, time seemed to slow. Her mind, the mind of an artist who saw the world in details, raced. She remembered the heavy pouch of fine metallic powder she kept in her pocket, a material she used for her shimmering night sky paintings. It was ground mica, harmless but brilliantly reflective. In one fluid, desperate motion, she tore the pouch from her pocket and as Rorik leaped, his jaws wide and ready to tear into her, she flung the entire contents directly into his face. The cloud of 1,000 tiny, glittering mirrors exploded in the moonlight, filling the air around Rorik's head. He was momentarily blinded, the dazzling, disorienting particles filling his eyes and nose. His ferocious charge broke. He landed awkwardly, shaking his great head, pawing at his face with a confused, furious snarl. That single second of distraction was all that was needed. A silver blur shot past her. With a final, explosive surge of power fueled by protective rage, Tenebris slammed into the disoriented Rorik. This time there was no contest. He pinned the larger wolf to the ground, his teeth at his throat, not biting down, but holding him in a clear, unbreakable submission. The fight was over. The Shadow Pack, seeing their defeated alpha, lowered their heads and began to slowly, silently retreat back into the shadows from whence they came. Tenebris released Rorik, who scrambled to his feet and with one last hate-filled glance, fled into the darkness, defeated and disgraced. As the adrenaline faded, Tenebris's form shifted back, and he stood before Elara, breathing heavily, his body bruised and bleeding, but his eyes, full of awestruck, profound love, were only for her. The departure of Rorik and his Shadow Pack was not marked by a dramatic roar or a final, crashing defeat, but by a slow, quiet seepage of their malevolent presence from the ancient woods. A profound and tangible peace began to return, washing over the territory like a cleansing rain. The birds, once again, sang their melodies without fear, and the gentle creatures of the forest emerged from their hiding places, sensing the restoration of their true guardian. In the days that followed the climactic battle, a subtle but powerful shift occurred within Tenebris's own pack. Where once they had tolerated Elara as their alpha's strange human fascination, they now looked upon her with a new and unwavering respect. They had witnessed her courage not as a foolish human's bravado, but as a strategic, steadfast strength that had directly turned the tide of the fight. She had not cowered, she had stood her ground and used her unique gifts to defend their leader and, by extension, their entire way of life. She was no longer just Tenebris's secret, she was now, unmistakably, their protector as well. Tenebris's wounds, both physical and spiritual, began to heal under the gentle, constant care of Elara's presence. The deep gashes on his skin closed, and the haunted shadow that had lingered in his twilight eyes since the challenge was issued slowly receded, replaced by a soft, profound warmth that seemed to emanate from his very core whenever she was near. The shared experience of the fight, the terror of nearly losing each other, and the triumphant victory they had achieved together had forged a bond between them that was stronger than any curse and more magical than any legend. They spent their days walking the familiar paths, but now their hands were clasped together, their silence a comfortable, loving conversation. He was no longer just the man teaching her about the forest. He was her partner, sharing his world with her, and she, in turn, filled his world with a light it had never known. As the sun began its slow, glorious descent on the seventh evening after the fight, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange, purple, and gold, Tenebris led Elara on a walk she had not taken before. They climbed a gentle, winding path that led upward, away from the thickest part of the forest, until they emerged onto a high, rocky cliff that overlooked the entire expanse of his territory. From this vantage point, they could see the rolling sea of treetops stretching out to the horizon, the silver ribbon of a distant river catching the last of the sun's rays, and the first, bold stars beginning to prick the darkening velvet of the evening sky. The full moon, once a symbol of dread and conflict, now rose behind them, a benevolent, silver giant casting a soft, romantic glow over the world below. It was here, in this place that felt like the top of the world, that Tenebris turned to face her. He took both of her hands in his touch firm yet infinitely tender. His eyes, reflecting the starlight and the moonlight, held hers with an intensity that made the rest of the universe seem to fade away. "Elara," he began, his voice a low, resonant whisper that carried over the gentle evening breeze. "Before you, my world was one of duty and shadows. I was a guardian of this land, but I never knew what it was to have a home for my heart. You saw the beast within me and you did not flinch. You saw the man beneath the struggle and you offered him your trust. You stood against the darkness not with tooth and claw, but with a courage and a cleverness that humbled me." He paused, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. "You are my strength. You are my peace. You are the other half of my soul I never knew was missing. You are my one true mate in this life and in every one that may follow." He went down on one knee, looking up at her, his expression open, vulnerable, and filled with more love than she had ever thought possible. "Will you do me the greatest honor? Will you be my mate? Forever?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy welled in Elara's eyes, spilling over to trace warm paths down her cheeks. She was not an artist of words, but her heart spoke for her. There were no grand speeches, no hesitations. There was only the simple, absolute truth of her answer. "Yes, Tenebris," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes. Forever." She sank to her knees in front of him, her hands moving to cradle his face. As their lips met in a soft, sealing kiss, a promise of 1,000 tomorrows passed between them. It was a kiss that held the memory of their first meeting, the tenderness of his care, the fear of the battle, and the triumphant joy of this moment. It was the beginning of everything. And as they broke apart, foreheads resting together, A single harmonious howl rose from the forest below. It was joined by another and then another, until the entire pack lifted their voices in a beautiful soaring chorus that echoed through the valleys and up to the stars. A sacred, celebratory song for their alpha and his chosen mate, a tribute to the love that had saved their home and bound two worlds together as one. Their story was just beginning. If you've been swept away by the love of Tenebris and Elara, and you want to be the first to discover more tales of magical bonds and triumphant romance, make sure to subscribe. A whole world of stories awaits, and your next favorite adventure is just a click away.